to give it to you, okay? So consider getting that book. And it's really great, too. You know, it's the scriptures, but it's the historical part of the scriptures from beginning to end. So we're in the third week, and we're in the book of Genesis here. Now, here's what happens, and here's kind of the thing you see in the text today, that in the times where God seems like he's the most absent in our lives are often the times where he does the most work in us. And the thing about that is when God does seem absent to us, when we are in times of struggle and we are in times of pain, we don't feel like he's working. We don't feel like he's present. We feel like that we're not favored, that he's not there, that he's not working. It's kind of like this guy Jedediah, okay? Jedediah gets up at 4 a.m, and he's got to go plow the field. He has a farm, and he gets up and he goes into the kitchen, and there's no breakfast for him. And man, he's got a full day ahead of him, no breakfast. He yells at his wife, "Why is there no breakfast?" He's like, "I'm sick, I can't get breakfast." He walks over to the coffee pot. The coffee pot's not working for some reason. Oh, he's got no coffee. So he goes outside, hooks up the oxen, starts plowing the field, however that works. And as he's plowing, the plow breaks. And he's like, "Oh, man." And he looks, and there's this part on the plow that he has to get in town that he can't fix. And so he finishes up best he can, and then he goes into the house just looking forward to lunch. I just need to get lunch, and then maybe I'll feel better. And he goes in, and he opens the fridge, and everything in the fridge is rotten because what he didn't know was that the electricity went out, and that's why the coffee pot wasn't working. All his food's spoiled, so he doesn't get any lunch. He's like, "Oh, man." So he gets the part, gets in the car, starts driving off. It's like an hour to town to replace this part. And as he's driving, he gets a flat tire. He's like, "Oh, my God." And so he gets out, he grabs, goes to the back to get the spare, and as he's doing that, it starts pouring down rain on him. And he's like, "Oh." And he gets the spare out, and he puts it on the car, and it turns out that the spare is also flat. And at this point, he just looks up to God, and he goes, "Why?" And then he hears a voice from heaven say, "I don't know, Jedediah. There's just something about you that chaps my hide." And I don't usually tell jokes like that, but when we struggle, think about this, when we struggle, we do, without articulating it, feel like, man, maybe I'm not favored, maybe God is not here, maybe he's absent. We think about things from the past, we think, where was God? And we think about things that we're going through, and we wonder where he is. And even though it's true that in the times where God seems absent, they turn out to be the times where God often does his greatest work in our lives. It doesn't feel like that when it's happening, but it really is true. That's my testimony. If I was to break down my testimony, I would tell you certain events and things that happened, and all of those things where God worked the most and he did the most in me and shaped me the most were times of struggle, times of difficulty. If you get a group of people together, if you ever go on a mission trip, this is what you find out everywhere. You see struggle, but then you hear people's stories. And, everywhere, I've personally gone on a trip, this is like a theme. When I was in India, ran into all these people. And I'll talk about this guy a little later, but one guy's name is Taharu. And he, at the time I met him, was like 50 years old. But when he was a boy, he was sold into slavery by his parents, not because they didn't love him, but because they didn't have any food. They couldn't provide for him and help him survive, so they had to sell him for a bag of rice. And so he's in slavery, and later on, here he is, and he's this pastor. When he tells the story, he talks about how later he was purchased out of that, and how he gave his life to Christ in the midst of that, and how then he went back in and he helped rescue kids out of slavery. And now there's 40 different boys that have grown up to become pastors under his leadership, and he gives his testimony. He says, man, the hardest time of my life, the times when it seemed like God was the most absent, are the times where he did the most in my life and through my life. And it's not just, when things happen to us. This is one of the mysteries of God, but God works in us when we turn to him, even when it's our fault. Because a lot of things aren't our fault. Things happen. But a lot of things are our fault. We get ourselves in a lot of our messes. But even then, when we turn to God hasn't abandoned us when we are his children. He doesn't abandon us because of where we go. He's with us, and he's always wanting us to turn to him. And even as we look back on those times when we turn to God, we see that even in the midst of the consequences we help create, God often does his greatest work. Remember Brock Johnson, a guy who is in Guatemala, and the Davises are going to Guatemala to work with him, and he was an agent for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and he believed in God, had, whatever, intellectual faith, had become a Christian, but was not living for God, and did all these things to ruin his family and ruin his life. And as he tells his story, and now he's in Guatemala, and now God's doing this amazing work through him and using him and his family to affect all these people. And as he tells his story, what he says, the time when God should have been the most absent are the times when God worked the most in his life. And just because God seems silent doesn't mean that he's not present. And that's what we see in the text today. And why is that? Why does that just seem to be true? Why does that just seem to be true when you reflect on your life, if you've been a believer for a while, and you look back and you see God's work? Well, one, because isn't that the time when a lot of us finally listen to God? I mean, a lot of times we don't hear God until there is desperation and struggle. C.S. Lewis has that great quote that God whispers to us in our pleasure. He speaks to us through our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain. I mean, often we won't turn to God until we need to. And that's kind of my story in a lot of ways. I mean, I have a similar story. I was talking to people this week about this, and we were sharing some different things. There's a lot of people where I believe, but then there was a point in my life where I really fully gave my life to Christ and said, God, do whatever you want in it. But all of those points are when I had to do it. And I wish it wasn't like that. I wish I had a better story where I was like, I turned to God and did this and did the right thing. But really, a lot of these points in my life are when I had to do it. And that's just kind of me. Like, there's just, and I wish it wasn't always like that, but God works in us. Sometimes he can't do it until, for us, we won't turn to him until we have to. But God is always working. And this is what we find out in the book of Genesis. So turn to Genesis chapter 39, and let's kind of look through this a little bit. And here you have an amazing story. And as you read through the story, the thing you see again and again is it just seems like God is not there. It seems like this guy is not favored. And then as you keep going through, you see evidence of God, and then you see again, like, man, if I was to interpret these circumstances, I would think God isn't there. And then at the end, you see the amazing things that God does. And it's the story of Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph takes up several chapters in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis, most of it is about 4 people. Again, there's millions and millions of things that God does in history. And yet we don't have all of that information, but we have what we need to know. Remember a few weeks ago I said it starts with creation, right? Then it goes to the time of the patriarchs, and this is a beard, right? The patriarchs are the fathers. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham was the first guy, and we talked about him last week. And God calls Abraham and shows the world at that time and for all time that what God cares about is faith. And he calls Abraham. And Abraham is the father of Isaac and Ishmael. And it tells the story next about Isaac and Ishmael. And some people think that that is the story of where the Muslims come from and then the Jews come from. That's not accurate. Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac is the forefather of the Jewish people, and Ishmael is the forefather of the Arabs. But it's not where the Muslim faith begins. The Muslim faith doesn't begin until the 7th century A.D. This is in 2000 B.C. So it's not for 2,700 years later. And remember, when Jesus comes, all the first believers are Jewish people. Jesus was a Jewish guy. The disciples were Jewish guys. All the first believers were Jewish guys. And then as it spread into these Arab regions. And so many of the first believers were Arabs. But Abraham is the first patriarch, and then his son is Isaac, and there's Isaac and Ishmael, and then God brings the Messiah through the line of Isaac. So Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. And Jacob is the father of Joseph. And Jacob has 12 sons. and those 12 sons become the leaders of the 12 tribes. So when you read in the Bible and you see all these names like Gad and Naphtali and Dan, and I don't think I can name them all, but Issachar and Judah and Simeon and Reuben and Benjamin, and then the other guys. Those are the 12 sons of Jacob. And Joseph at the time was the youngest son. But he was Jacob's favorite son, and that was a problem. And if you want some really bad parenting advice, here it is. Pick a favorite, okay? If you have kids now, pick a favorite. Whenever you get kids, pick a favorite and just mess up your whole family, okay? Just do that, all right? That's really bad parenting advice. And that's what Jacob did. He favored Joseph, even though Joseph was his youngest son at the time. But he favored him because at the time he had a couple different wives and he loved Joseph's mom a lot. And so he favored Joseph. And then what he did was, and this is a famous story, and most of us know this story in some different ways, and I'm going to give you a lot of history today. He gave him a multicolored coat. That's what the text says. Gave him multicolored, which you and I were like, that's kind of lame. I mean, none of us would wear a multicolored coat, right? But at the time, this was an expensive coat, and it seems to be something that indicated kind of like royalty, like he'd give him a coat that a king would wear. And so not only does he favor Joseph, but he gives him this coat, and what he's kind of in effect saying in the presence of his brothers, when his brothers see this coat, is that here Joseph is, and even though he's not the firstborn, I'm going to treat him like he's the firstborn. And what that means then is that when I die, he's the one who's going to get all the inheritance, and so there's all these dimensions to this, all these reasons for his brothers to hate Joseph. So here's what happens next. So all the brothers are off in an area like miles away, tending all the flocks, and his father, Jacob, sends Joseph, says, go check up on your brothers. And so he goes up to check on his brothers. And when they find out he's coming, they react in hatred, and they throw him into a pit. They throw him into a pit. And so he's in this pit, and they don't know what they're going to do with him yet. They just know that they hate this guy. And so let's throw him in a pit, and then let's figure out what to do. And his oldest brother, Reuben, wants to get him out, but in the middle of the night, his other brothers come, and they take him, and they sell him to a traveling caravan of Ishmaelites. They sell him. Now, then it says in Genesis 39, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt because the Ishmaelites came, and when they got to Egypt, they sold him to Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Now think about how cursed and how disfavored Joseph really is. I mean, if you kind of look at the situation, here he was, the favored son, here he is with this, coat, and he has this, which signifies that his future is set because he's going to get this big inheritance. And then all of a sudden, his brothers who hate him, they take him and they throw him into a pit. And think about what his prayers would have been like, too. Think about his prayers. Here he is in a pit, okay? And Joseph is a follower of God, and he's praying, God, get me out of this pit, get me out of this pit. Lord, I know you can do this. I know you can deliver me out of this pit. And then his brothers come, and they take him, and it gets worse. It's like, okay, God didn't answer that prayer. And then they take him, and there's a traveling caravan, and they sell him to this caravan, and now he's in this caravan. He has nothing. Now he's a slave. He's been sold. And now he's going, okay, God, but I know that you can show up. I know you can deliver me. So make some kind of intersection happen with this caravan and take me out of this situation. And no, they go all the way to Egypt, and they sell him far, far away from home to an Egyptian household. Now, if you were in that situation, and that was you, and we've probably never been in that situation exactly before, but we've been in circumstances where we have felt like things really aren't going our way, or we're really getting a lot of the brunt of life. You would feel like, wow, where is God? Where is God? He hasn't delivered me. He hasn't taken me out of this. When I prayed, it got worse. When I prayed again, it got worse again. And you might feel disfavored. And by looking at the circumstances, it kind of looks like that. And so the next line after that should say something like, and God doesn't care about Egypt or about Joseph. It should say, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there because God just didn't care about Joseph, right? Or it should say, that, he just wasn't favored anymore. And they bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there because he just wasn't favored anymore. But look at what it actually says. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph. And that is a strange thing to read as you read this story, because everything about what's happening indicates the opposite, that God isn't with him, that God doesn't favor him, that God is absent. So how is that possible, that the Lord is with Joseph? Because when a person belongs to God, God never leaves them. And the scripture repeats this verse 2 times. God has said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." So we say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me?" And so in this text here, in the book of Genesis, chapter after chapter after chapter stays on the life of Joseph and tells all these circumstances again and again and again, shows what happens in his life. Of all the millions of things that have happened in the world and all the things God does, it tells this story and spends all these chapters on this story. Why? So that God's people will always know that he never leaves them nor forsakes them. Although your circumstances will change, your relationship to your Father will not. So contrary to how it seemed, contrary to how a person who doesn't understand God and who he really is might feel, the Lord was with Joseph. And then it says, and he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And there's things that happen in the text we see again and again, how Joseph turns towards God and turns towards God. And our temptation, of course, is to sometimes consider turning away. God, I don't feel you here, and I'm turning away. But Joseph turns towards God. And every time, God blesses him. So the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. He lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and this is a really interesting thing to say, when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and because his attendant Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. So the reason that's interesting is because this is an Egyptian who has a whole set of different gods. And here comes this guy, and it doesn't say that when Potiphar saw how smart Joseph was, or when Potiphar saw what a good guy Joseph was. It says, when Potiphar saw the Lord was with him, he put him in charge. When he saw what the Lord did, that he gave Joseph success in everything he did, he put him in charge. And that's just an interesting reality about life when we follow God, that people watch people. People watch people. You watch people. You see how people respond. And people watch you and see how you respond. And one of the most profound ways that people are affected, and one of the clearest doorways that people see God and who he is through the response of God's people. The trust that God's people put in him when they're going through hard times. And so Potiphar sees, and he knows his story. He knows where he's been and how he came here. And Potiphar sees Joseph's response. And when he sees that the Lord was with him, he puts him in charge. So things start going good, but then something else bad happens. The next thing that happens is Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with Joseph. And that's a bad thing, all right? And it says why. Genesis 39, 7-9. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Okay, so it gives us the reason why Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with Joseph. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. Here's what he said. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And she keeps trying and trying. He says no. He gives her this speech. You would think that she would go, okay, yeah, my bad, but no, she keeps trying. And he keeps refusing. And one day, she just gets really aggressive. And as you read the text, it says that she grabs him and tries to hold him. And he pulls himself away. And as he pulls himself away, she holds on to his robe. And as he runs out, she has his robe and he runs out naked, okay? She's angry. She's been rejected. He runs away. He's like, forget it, not going to happen. And so what she does, because she feels rejected and she's angry, she tells her husband that Joseph tried to rape her. And so that turns out bad. Potiphar gets angry. And it says, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph is doing okay. God has blessed him. And now here we go again. Now he's put in prison. He's treated unjustly. Someone lies about him, accuses him falsely. And God doesn't come in and, bring a servant in to say, no, wait, I know what actually happened. None of that happens. He's accused. He's convicted. He goes to prison. And how would you feel if this was you, right? And as you look at this text, you would just feel like, man, God, I turned to you. I've been following you and, felt like you were using me. And now look where I am. You've left me. You've let this happen. And so as you read the story, and it says Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, it should say because God forgot him. Because God had forgotten about him. Or it should say Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, because God really didn't care anymore about Joseph because God was absent. But that's not what it says. It says Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Because although our circumstances will change, our relationship with our Father does not. The Lord never leaves his children. And this guy, not just when things happen to us, but even when we bring about our circumstances, the Lord was with him. So he's there for a while. He's there for a while. And as he's there, the prison warden sees that God is with him and puts him in charge again. So he's raised up again. And here's what happens next. After a while, as he's in prison, these other two men are put in prison. One's a baker and one is a cupbearer of the king. And they have these nightmares. And they talk about these nightmares that they had. And God reveals to Joseph the interpretation of these dreams. These men, it wasn't just, tacos or whatever. They actually had these dreams from God, right? So God gives him the interpretation of these dreams. And so he tells these men, here's what's going to happen. One of you is going to be killed. You are going to be killed, and you are going to be restored. And everyone in the prison hears it. It's public. It's like, probably no one believed it. Probably the prison warden didn't believe it. Probably the other prisoners didn't believe it. Probably the baker and the cupbearer probably didn't believe it. Who's this guy? You're going to be beheaded. You're going to be restored. But then it happens. That's exactly what happens. And so this interpretation, this word from God is confirmed because that's what happens. And you would think now, oh man, okay, God has intervened. Now he's going to bring Joseph out. And here's a line that's kind of tough when you go through this yourself. When you're struggling in your circumstances, it says in Genesis 41:1, when 2 full years had passed. And we hate that line because what we want when we're going through something is 2 full days to have passed, right? Right? When 2 hours had passed, but it's not like that all the time. Sometimes it's 2 full years. Sometimes we're in the midst of things, and we even go to God, and we even find some strength, but then a week later we're back, and a week later we're back, and we are in the midst of something, and it is so long. And we're tempted to feel like we're alone. We're tempted to feel like God isn't with us. And 2 full years have passed. And I'm sure that was what was going through Joseph's head. Wow, 2 full years have passed, and there's nothing. But then it says, when 2 full years have passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Pharaoh had a dream. And here's what happened with his dream. Pharaoh had, again, this vision, and it must have been alarming. Again, there's something different about having a vision than just a dream. There's something very real about it where the person knows, wow, this is not your ordinary dream. And so he's alarmed. So he gets all his officials, and he tries to get them to interpret this dream, because he knows this is somehow a divine thing. He doesn't know where it's from, but he knows somehow the gods have given this to him somehow. But they can't interpret it. And Pharaoh's upset, and so he's ready to kill people. And so these guys these wise men find out about Joseph. Because again, what he did with these other guys was public. It was known that God gives this man interpretation. So they said that God gives this man interpretations. You should ask him. So they bring Joseph into Pharaoh's court, which in itself is an amazing thing, that this guy from these nomadic tribes in this far land, this guy who was basically a slave and then in prison, is brought before the court of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh reveals this dream. And what the dream is that there's these 7 skinny cows that end up eating these 7 fat cows. And then there's these 7 little skinny, wasted away ears of corn that end up somehow swallowing up. Or no, the 7 full ears of corn end up swallowing up. No, it's the skinny ones that swallow up the full ones. So the skinny cows eat the fat cows, and the skinny little corn eats the big fat, corn that you'd want to eat corn. And Pharaoh's like, what does this mean? And Joseph says, I don't know, but God knows. And God will reveal it. And so God reveals the dream to Joseph, and Joseph tells Pharaoh, here's what it means. Here's what God says. And again, there's a part of this that we don't know I just got to say this. We don't know everything that God does in history, because this kind of stuff happens all throughout the Bible, where God brings his witness to another nation. And here, this is the most powerful kingdom in the world at the time. There's the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and there's the African kingdoms and all this, but there's all kinds of things that happen in all these places where God brings his witness and he changes lives. And there's some theories about this, about the Pharaoh at the time, and did that Pharaoh later in the next generation, did he reform Egypt and turn it to monotheism for a couple generations? We don't know. But we know God works in all these different places. And we don't have all the information, but we have what we need to know. And what we know happens is this. Joseph reveals the vision. He says, okay, what God is saying is there's going to be 7 years of prosperity. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine, of scarcity. Now, the problem with that is this, is that in times of prosperity, people don't conserve. People get prosperity hungry, and they waste, and that's just a symptom of prosperity. That's what happens. People waste, people waste, people waste. And so all the food that you really need to be saving, people are going to waste. They're not going to recognize that we should be saving up for the future. They're just going to waste and waste and waste and waste. And so what we need to do in the 7 years of prosperity is we need to save up and save up and save up, so that in the 7 years of famine, 7 years of famine is a long time. 1 year of famine is a long time. 1 year when they don't have crops is a long time. That will kill hundreds of thousands of people. 7 years is unthinkable, because there's going to be no food anywhere, because it's agricultural societies. This is how they survive. We're going to have 7 years of no crops being produced. We need to save, 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 save. And so Pharaoh says, what should we do? And Joseph's like, you got to find someone who's wise, who can take charge and make the people and turn, make Egypt save and store up. And so then the Pharaoh says this. Pharaoh says in Genesis 41, 39 through 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And so Pharaoh appoints Joseph in charge. And it saves millions and millions and millions of people. It saves millions and millions of people. How? What happened? In the times where it seemed like God was the most absent in Joseph's life, God was doing his greatest work. And we could break that all down and look at what he actually did. He prepared Joseph spiritually and in leadership in these different places. You're never just waiting. See, that's the thing. You find out later you're never just waiting. You're never just going through something. God is preparing. God is doing things. God is shaping you. God is taking you. We're not making an argument that God is making those things happen to you. It's not what the text is saying. It is saying, though, that God is there and God is present and God will work. And if you turn to God, God will show up in your life. And so he does that. He prepares Joseph spiritually. He prepares him in leadership. He positions Joseph the way he needs to. He uses Joseph's life as a testimony in all these places that he goes and brings it to Egypt. Now, a follower of the one true God is in the middle of the court of Pharaoh. God is with Joseph the whole time. The whole time. He is not with Joseph more now that he is second in charge of Egypt than he was when he was a prisoner in prison. The circumstances make no difference to whether or not God was his father and Joseph was his child. The circumstances don't change that. God is always with his people. And so this is an amazing part of history. And if you read in the text, if you go in the story and you read it here, read the historical part, there's so much to this. First, the Egyptian people are saved because Joseph forces them to store up. They build all these barns. He forces them to store up at least 20% of all that they harvest. And so they have all this seed and so all these different things to prepare for the next few years. And then when the famine starts, the people of Egypt are saved because they didn't save. The people didn't listen. They don't listen. People don't listen in times of prosperity. The people didn't listen. But it was okay because Joseph had made the government say, oh, that's a crazy thing to say. But he did. He made the government save all of this stuff. And so what happened is then the people would come to the government at this time of scarcity and say, look, we need food. And so they would say, okay, you can buy food. And so they would buy food. And this started to make the nation of Egypt rich. And then when all their money ran out, and this is what the text says, they said, we don't have any more money. What do we do? And they said, we'll sell ourselves to you if we'll just survive. And what Joseph had them do was sell all their property. So they sold all their property. And then Joseph, now with all of Egypt became the property of Egypt, of the Egyptian government. He gave the property back to the people, but said, you get this back on this condition. It belongs to us. You get to keep 80%, but you have to give us 20% from now on. And so Egypt becomes this massively wealthy nation because of this. And then other people in different countries had to start coming to Egypt, and they had to pay for food. And one of the groups of people that came were these nomadic people from the land of Canaan. They were the sons of Jacob, and they come looking for food. And there's a whole part of this that plays out when Joseph reveals who he is. And when Joseph reveals to his brothers, it's me, Joseph, the one you tried to kill. They think Joseph is now going to kill them. But Joseph is like so far beyond that. He's like, you don't get it. All of this stuff, God was working. Even in your sin. Even in your sin, God was working. And so it says in Genesis 45, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It wasn't because God didn't love me. It wasn't because God was absent. God was working. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And then there's a famous line here in Genesis 50. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And there's so many ways in which God worked through Joseph's life, revealed himself to these people in all these different places. And who knows, most of what God does through us and our response in those hard times, we never get to see on earth. We get to see sometimes. I mean, I have a story, and I've told this, about my kids. I'm not going to talk about it now, but where I've seen people come to Christ because of the suffering of one of my daughters. I mean, I've actually gotten to see several people because of this connection we've had with these people, but you don't always get to see that. For everything you get to see, when you turn to God in your struggle, there's 10 or 50 or 100 things you don't see that God does. And one day we will see it all. And probably with Joseph, he didn't even get to see all the things that God did because he turned to him in these times of struggle. But God was with him. And in the times where it seemed like God was the most absent, God was doing his greatest work. And how does that make you and I feel? And think about yourself. How does that make you think about God? How does it make you feel right now in the midst of whatever it is you're facing? That God, if you have put your faith in Christ and you are God's child, that God says he will never leave you nor forsake you, that he is with you. And he's not just with you. See, after Jesus, the Spirit of God is in you. He's so much closer than that. He is so much closer than that. And I made a kind of a list as I thought about people that I've been praying with for the last few weeks. There's a guy here who's facing cancer who's younger than me. I have two friends whose children are facing serious disease in the hospital. Several friends here that have lost their source of income. Several friends here that are waiting for God to connect them to a godly spouse. Several friends of different types of uncertainty. How does that change our response and how we feel, knowing that God is with us? Remember Jesus, he said this stuff all the time. Number one command in the Bible, do not be afraid. And he says the very last thing he says to his disciples. Matthew chapter 28, verse 20. Very last thing he says, surely I will be with you always. Just knowing God is with you and just remembering God is with you, it renews your strength, right? In the scripture it says that those who wait on the Lord, they will renew their strength. It renews your strength. You come back to God again and go, okay, God, I know you're here. I think it gives us confidence where to turn, right? We're tempted to feel like he's absent, but when we know he's with us, it gives us confidence where to turn, that we have God as our source of help. And two, we're tempted when we're the one who brings about our circumstances, we're tempted to think that, well, God doesn't want me to turn to him, but he does. So how does that, what does that tell us? What does that tell you where you are? What does God call you to do, knowing that he is with you and that he will never leave you nor forsake you? What I want to do is I want to pray for each other right now. There's a scripture, Psalm 43:5. It says, why so downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. I just want you to kind of, and do this once in a while. Look around, just look at people, just look at them, right? Okay, then look back at me. And as we pray, just think about them, okay? And let's pray for each other. Heavenly Father,